And now for tonight, I'm going to introduce our speaker. One of our own, Stephanie Arduini, is the Deputy Director of the museum. She oversees the education, collections, and exhibit work. And she has worked for a variety of museums around the country for nearly 20 years. She has a history degree from the University of Michigan and a master's degree in museum education from George Washington University. So with that, I will turn the screen over to Stephanie.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thanks for coming out. I am excited to talk with you about the 15th Amendment, especially its anniversary year this year, really. So it was passed and ratified in 1870. So we're celebrating its 150th anniversary. And just as much as we've been talking about the 19th Amendment, the centennial of women getting the right to vote, I think this is another big anniversary that is valuable to talk about where that right to vote comes from. So I'm going to take us through a brief history of where this came from. Where did this amendment, how did it come to be? Why did people feel 150 years ago that we needed an amendment to the Constitution that talked about the right to vote? And especially, I'm kind of glad it's a small group of us tonight because I like to ask questions. I kind of come from an educator background. So I'll be asking questions. I would just love if you're feeling comfortable enough to add your responses in the chat. And with that, let me pause for a second and pull up my slides. There we go. All right, there's my email. Should you have any questions or ever want to send me a nice email or a weird email, whatever, you have my information. And you're welcome to always contact us at the museum if you have any comments, questions, or anything like that. So just some questions I wanted to plant in your head tonight is, what is included in freedom? What does it mean to be free? What is a citizen? Who gets to be a citizen in our country? What's included in citizenship? Is voting something that's included for citizens? Is it a right of everybody? And who are these people who shaped the words that are still shaping one of the key ways that we participate in our democracy today? So before we start, I just want to get us in our mindset of thinking about voting and thinking about times when we voted in the past. So I'd like you to think about the first time that you voted. And if you could share in the chat, just what was that like? What informed or how did you know how to vote? What made you want to vote? If you haven't voted before, why haven't you voted? Is there a barrier in the way to your voting or something that's preventing you from voting? And as people are thinking about it, I'll share my story. I was curious about this and trying to remember the first time that I've ever voted, which was probably when I was a freshman in college when I turned 18. I don't really remember the election that I was voting in, but I knew I was excited to vote. I had been around voting since I was little. My mom would take all of us, my brothers and sister, to vote, and it just looked cool. It looked kind of exclusive, the fact that we weren't allowed to vote and there was this cool machine and like a booth and a thing that you poked holes in. That just seemed really neat. And then as I got older, the idea that voting was something that also helped to shape the world around us, that made me very excited to participate in that process. Let me see, I see somebody, there we go. Lisa says she couldn't wait to vote because it gives you a voice. Absolutely. And I think that's an interesting place to reflect on is what is our relationship to voting? How do we approach it? How does it make us feel? And I think about that as I encounter stories of people in history who don't have access to voting, or people who do have access to voting or the right to vote and are thinking about others who don't. How how do those different perspectives compare? What are people saying who don't have the right to vote but want the right to vote? What value do they see in participating in the political process? It helps me to think more about my own participation by reflecting and comparing it to others. Okay. Where is my slide not moving? There we go. So to go and kind of look at the full context of where voting rights have come from, I'm going to rewind us all the way back to the Constitution of 1787, this document that forms the basis of how our government operates. And the Constitution itself helped to define a little bit more about the relationship between people who live in our country and the government itself. But one thing that I think is really interesting is that the Constitution, as many of you might know, was a document that was framed to constrain the federal government in many ways. It described how it worked, but it also was trying to prevent an overzealous power, kind of like how the colonists saw King George and the British government before. So saying the federal government can't do this, it can't do this, it can't do this to the states, it can't do this to the people. It was more putting boundaries on the federal government just as much as it was describing how it all worked together. But it started to shape how people thought of themselves in relationship to their government. And one thing that I think is also important to understand as we jump forward later into the Civil War era is that people were thinking about different kinds of rights. Rights, even though they called them rights, weren't all the same. There were different categories that applied differently to different people and were shaped differently. So there were the natural rights that were inalienable rights, that stuff that comes out of the Declaration of Independence. So the idea of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and kind of the working form of that being the right to direct yourself in the world, to be able to improve your lot in life. There were also civil rights, which were a kind of legal right that was essential to pursuing your livelihood or protecting. Oh, here's where my little screen with all of our faces is getting in the way of my notes. There we go. Protecting your personal security. So the idea of the right to own property, the right to go to court, the right to enter into contracts, the right of being able to move around freely. These were things that were civil rights that everybody had, just like everybody had inalienable rights, no matter what your status was. But the idea of the rights of all free people could have civil rights and the states could regulate them. So you could put boundaries on those civil rights and it was up to the states to decide who was going to do that. There are these things called political rights that were more treated like privileges, and voting is a key part of that. So thinking about people and their, especially when it comes to the era of the Constitution and the founding of the country, voting was a privilege that not everybody got to share. And states, again, could determine who got to have that right. And then there was this other weird category of social rights that were more related to personal things and business things. It was pretty amorphous. Government didn't really get involved in those. But you can see almost how there's an umbrella of inalienable rights and natural rights, and then you start getting boundaries put on them, and it's the states who are figuring out what those boundaries should be. And as our country ages and the 19th century continues, you see a lot of challenges to these different rights. So for example, in the Dred Scott v. Sandford case in 1857, Dred Scott and his wife Harriet Scott were enslaved people from Missouri who were taken by their owner to places where there was not slavery. And so they were using laws and making the argument that they should be free, and they sued in court for their freedom. And this is an excerpt from the argument written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, saying in the majority opinion that, well, okay, I see that you're suing for your freedom, but based on his argument, he said that African Americans, in his opinion, were not, or based on his legal opinion and evidence, that African Americans are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution. And therefore, they can't claim any of the rights or privileges granted to citizens. And so it said that African Americans essentially were not able to participate in some of those civil rights that other people in the country could participate in. So they're not citizens and eligible of the protections and privileges accounted to them. So we're thinking about the frame of mind that people are in, this idea of different kinds of rights and the ability to regulate them. And key to that is that states are the ones doing that regulation. But I also want to back up for a second and talk about voting and what are elections like before the Civil War. So they're a pretty crazy thing. This is a famous painting of Election Day in America. But the idea that these are very public affairs before the Civil War. Places where you would pick your ballot. Sometimes you would pick up a ballot publicly from a booth of the party that you were voting for in full view of everybody else. Sometimes you would have to, depending on your location, you might have to verbally say who you're voting for in public in front of other people. So this was a place that brought communities together in some ways, but other ways it was rife for fraud, for intimidation, for bribery. But being able to participate in the political process was something that was really important to Americans and kind of its identity of itself. And during the Jacksonian era, when Andrew Jackson was president, they'd started expanding voting rights to more people. Initially in America, most people, there were property requirements that people had, or that states had, on the right to vote. So you had to own or have a certain amount of property in your name to be eligible to vote. And as states chose to remove those barriers, that expanded who could vote, but it kind of kept it expanded just to white men. And in places, states were restricting the right to vote, where previously African Americans or even some women who might have had the ability to vote and did have the right to vote in early years, they started restricting that. So expanding it for white men, but restricting it for other people before the Civil War. And another thing that complicates the moments of the creation of the 15th Amendment is the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War. So this idea that not only is Abraham Lincoln trying to undermine the ability of the Confederacy to wage war by undermining slavery itself, it also creates the ability of Black men to serve in the US military, in the United States colored troops. And this is something that African Americans and their allies point to, because the idea of military service was a key part of the identity of a citizen. So now if they're technically able to serve in the military, shouldn't that also give them the right to vote or access to these other privileges and rights afforded to citizens more broadly across the country? And so I have a couple of quotes here. There's a member of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, so that famous Black regiment from the movie Glory, who wrote in 1864 that if we fight to maintain a Republican government, we want Republican privileges. All we ask is the proper enjoyment of the rights of citizenship. And pretty consistently, Black people, abolitionists, saw this idea of citizenship and expanding what rights are included in citizenship. And in many ways, the right to vote is getting wrapped up in that very quickly and closely. Another Black soldier from the Civil War described that he and his fellow soldiers were fighting for the exercise of our political, free, civil, and public rights. So they're fighting, they're seeing this identity of expanding their ability to be seen as a citizen, and a part of the fabric shaping the country is a key part of the vision of the future that they're fighting for during the Civil War. But after the Civil War, slavery ends, especially with the 13th Amendment, which we'll get to. But as soon as African Americans are starting to get themselves out of slavery, seizing freedom, and starting to make claims on what that life is for them, it brought up this question of what does that freedom mean? They're free from slavery, but what else is coming with that? What else is included in that freedom? And so I'm going to stop there and just kind of ask that question to the group. What does freedom mean to you? How would you define it? If you want to just put your answer in the chat. It's a big, big question. And to me, I think frequently about some of these big ideas in our history, like what does freedom mean? And I find it really useful to look at people who didn't have access to that as a way to understand, for example, for people who didn't have freedom, as soon as they have freedom, what does that mean? Rod says personal choice, the ability to choose, make your own choices. Directing yourself. Absolutely. And in a lot of stories coming out of the Civil War of African Americans getting away from slavery and kind of establishing and defining freedoms for themselves, one of the first things that that I see frequently as a common theme in these stories is they're looking for family first. So the ability to have and maintain their family, keep it together. The ability to get an education, learning, reading, things that had been denied to them. But then also that ability to participate in the larger civic system, to shape the communities that they're living in. And I can't see the chat anymore, but that's okay, I'll keep going. But it wasn't clear what freedom meant. It was something that Abraham Lincoln kind of knew the Emancipation Proclamation was imperfect. He wasn't sure if it was legal. He wasn't sure if it was going to stay, or, you know, that a Congress who had different ideas about what should be a part of the country might pass a different law. So if you've seen the movie Lincoln, you might know the story of the 13th Amendment a little bit more, but the idea of how to enshrine the end of slavery, the abolition of slavery, into the Constitution, because amending the Constitution is a really hard process, which to me makes this period right after the war really, really remarkable when you get 3 amendments in pretty quick succession after the end of the war. So before the war is over, Congress has passed the 13th Amendment, and it's getting ratified in that year that the war ends. And you can see the language of the war, or the language of the amendment, that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime for which the party, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And an important part, number 2, that Congress can enforce this law. But here, it doesn't answer the question we were just talking about. It doesn't say what freedom means. It just ends slavery. So this is a big question that people who are finding that freedom for themselves, you know, it's good that slavery is done, but what does that mean for their life? Are they citizens? It's kind of implied, but not really. It's not clear. And there's certain legal things that having that definition of citizenship is crucial to helping them access. A crazy kind of reality TV story, to me at least, happens after the end of the war. After Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson takes over as president. And a lot of this period of how you put the country back together, how you start to transition out of war into something that can bring people back together, that can reunify people. How do you balance that reunification and that processing and that healing with justice? Since the United States viewed the Confederacy as states in open rebellion, as committing treason. How do you balance those things? And then how do you balance transitioning the 4 million formerly enslaved people into freedom? This is a lot on anybody's plate, and Andrew Johnson takes over, and his plan, or what he does, is something that infuriates the Republicans in Congress, who have to kind of just sit back and watch since Congress is on recess. They're not in session at the time that Johnson is making a lot of decisions, such as allowing former Confederates to come and ask for a pardon and begin to participate in the larger society again. And in December of 1866, as Congress is getting ready to come back into session, people like Thaddeus Stevens, the gentleman on the right, he and his fellow Republicans are furious. They're really, really upset about watching people like the former Confederate Vice President Alexander Stevens coming back to try to sit down and run the country again, just like nothing had happened. So they used a part of the law that allowed the Congress to not seat anybody that they deemed unfit, and they didn't seat any of this delegation from the former Confederacy as a way to say, okay, Andrew Johnson, we don't like what you're doing. You're not doing enough to protect the civil and human rights of formerly enslaved people. You're not doing enough to punish Confederates, so we're going to take over Reconstruction. But I think that's an important tone, because no longer is Andrew Johnson creating policy, but it's Republicans who have their foundation, in many of them, in abolition circles. Thaddeus Stevens was a big abolitionist, who are driving policy. And many of them see the transition and protection of civil and human rights for formerly enslaved people as a moral obligation. And that drives a lot of their decision making. After the 13th Amendment, let me back up here. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is one of the first pieces of legislation they passed to protect rights of African Americans who almost immediately had seen threats to themselves, but also yearning for legal definition about what was going on. So this was part of the enforcement part of the 13th Amendment, that Congress shall have the power to enforce this legislation. But it includes language that shows up again in just a minute in the 14th Amendment, the idea of if you're born in this country, you're a citizen. You are eligible for that. It solves that question. And formerly enslaved people, if you were here, you are a citizen. And it says that people those citizens are entitled to equal protection of the law. You can't not enforce laws for this group of citizens over this group of citizens. As this law is passed in the early April, I think it was December of 1866, but Johnson vetoes it, and the Congress passes it over his veto, the first time that this had really been done with any major legislation. There are also some major episodes of racial violence that are cropping up in former Confederate states. So this is an illustration of violence that happens in Memphis, Tennessee. Very shortly thereafter, there's another uprising in New Orleans, Louisiana, where you had African Americans and their white allies advocating for some of these legal and civil rights, and then conservative white Southerners who were leading a violent rebellion against them, with many of the African Americans and their white allies being injured or killed. So that became a sign to Congress that they needed something more. They needed to keep defining what freedom meant. So this is where the 14th Amendment comes up, that amends the Constitution with that legal definition of citizenship, with equal protection of those laws. And it's not just that citizens get equal protection, but all people who live in the United States get some of these equal protections. So it's even beyond the idea of citizenship. And Congress again says that they've got the power to enforce this. This is deeply unpopular in former Confederate states. And one of the ways that Congress is trying to get this passed and encourage former Confederate states to ratify this is to threaten their apportionment in Congress by saying that if you're denying the rights of men to vote in your state who are at least 21 years old and citizens, then if you threaten that or reduce it, then we are going to reduce the number of seats that you have in Congress. So it's in your best interest to let these people vote. This is not just interesting in that kind of Reconstruction political game of how they're trying to put the country back together, but this is the first time that voting appears in the Constitution. This is also the first time that the word male, any gender, appears in the Constitution. And this is something that is infuriating for women who are advocating for inclusion in this moment of expanded rights. So for example, women before the war, they are humans. They have certain inalienable rights, but they have some civil rights, but states can regulate that. They're denied other civil rights, and some of their rights are overtaken by the rights of their husbands in marriage. So there are limits to what their rights are. And as the country after the Civil War is thrown open this question of what does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to be free? Who gets to participate in this country? We've torn it apart, we're putting it back together, and now we're asking these gigantic, huge questions. And women who were involved in women's suffrage movements, many of them also had their background in the abolition movement. So they're active, they're agitating, they want to keep expanding this to include rights for women. And seeing gender put into the Constitution like this is really, really frustrating. So even Frederick Douglass is furious about some of these pieces by even sidestepping the official right to vote in this amendment, which had been up for debate. And in November 1867, he's fuming and said, "Let no man be kept from the ballot box because of his color. Let no woman be kept from the ballot box because of her sex." But this doesn't really solve anything. It takes a while. You can see how Congress passes this amendment in June 1866, and it takes about 2 years for it to be ratified. It took half that time for the 13th Amendment to be ratified. But one of the things that's cropping up is in these local elections where Black men are starting to vote, there's still a lot of racial violence and open intimidation at the polls. And that inspires Congress to pass some additional legislation, including the Reconstruction Acts, which says, okay, fine, we're taking over Reconstruction, we're having the military run this. It breaks down the former Confederacy into 5 military districts, and it sets requirements to the states if they want to rejoin the United States. So they have to write new constitutions for their states. They need new state governments, and Black men need to be able to vote for those constitutional conventions, the delegates to the conventions, and in any elections. And they have to ratify the 14th Amendment. And later they also kind of add they have to ratify the 15th Amendment. But this drastically expands who can vote. It also, the Reconstruction Acts put out more descriptions of what happens if you're not following these laws. And in the year 1867, the potential for voting, that kind of potential voting rights for Black men starts at about 1% of Black men being eligible to vote in the beginning of 1867. And by the end of the year, it's over 80% of people are included in laws, of Black men are included in laws that would make them eligible to vote. And it inspires African Americans who had been denied participation in this legal process. It inspires them to get really excited. They'd been hungry for this. And this picture here is a picture of, it's called actually Electioneering in the South. It's from 1868. But African Americans were forming communities and really coming together about just discussing these big constitutional ideas, organizing for politics and for voting, even with the threat of political violence. Another interesting point about the 14th Amendment is even while it didn't include the full definition of Black suffrage, in that this would not have been able to pass or be ratified without Black voters, helping to create these new states governments and state constitutions in formerly Southern states. So when the Civil War ends, Black suffrage is not something that's incredibly popular, but just a couple of years later, now you have a massive expansion of the right to vote for Black men, and it's becoming increasingly popular, and it's helping Republicans get things done in terms of passing more protections for civil and human rights for former African Americans, and through it laws and projects that also help a lot of other Americans. So expanding voting rights was also good in some places that had barriers for like property barriers or things like that for poor white people. Now they're getting some of those barriers removed. Or for example, here in Virginia, these new legislatures that were shaped and participated in by Black legislators were also creating systems of public education, for example, that benefited everybody and not just African Americans. But like I said, Black suffrage was still not crazy popular. It's getting more support, but in 1867, voters in Connecticut, in Kansas, and Minnesota rejected proposals to expand Black voting or Black suffrage to their citizens. Those were all states that were not in the Confederacy. And so the 14th Amendment and its kind of expansion of voting access for Black men only applied to states that were in the former Confederacy. It didn't expand to the rest of the country. But minds were changing. And here's a quote from Charles Sumner, who the historian Eric Foner described as perhaps the most principled egalitarian in Congress. He's writing a letter to British reformer John Bright, and he said, "For a long time, I was perplexed by the subtlety so often presented that suffrage is a privilege and not a right. And that being a privilege, it was subject to such limitations as the policy or goodwill of the legislature chose to impose. But the more I think of it, the more it seems to me it's an essential right." So this is something that especially Northerners were coming around to this idea that, okay, we've been thinking about the right to vote as a privilege, but we know that citizenship is something that becomes an obvious essential to formerly enslaved people, especially Black men. But yeah, the right to vote is maybe not just a privilege, maybe it's an essential right of citizenship that should have more access. So it brings us to the 15th Amendment. As Congress was looking out at the world and seeing continued hindrance and violence trying to stop especially African American men from voting, and facing calls of hypocrisy for expanding voting rights in former Confederate states, but not looking at the right to vote for Black men in northern states or western states, they created this amendment to kind of address that. So it was passed by Congress in February of 1869, ratified about a year later in February 1870. And Section 1 reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." And then Section 2, Congress can enforce this. But if you look, it doesn't say that all Black men can vote. It doesn't say anything about gender. But it just says that you can't deny the right to vote based on somebody's race or color or previous condition of servitude. This is something that scholars call a negative amendment. It just says you can't do this. And coming into the idea of creating the 15th Amendment, there were many people who were advocating for a positive amendment that says all people, for example, who are 21 years of age, all men can vote. Something that said these are the people who can do something, not just these are the things you can't do. But it speaks to how messy and how divisive the idea of Black suffrage in particular still was. This was a document and an amendment created from compromise. And I'll get into that in a minute, but this is a fantastic lithograph here, kind of print, to show some of the different pieces of the story being celebrated around or used to talk about the 15th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment is something that we continue to litigate in huge, extensive ways today, but kind of passed fairly quietly during Reconstruction 15th Amendment caused massive celebrations, especially in Black communities. There was the biggest one, brought out tens of thousands of people in the city of Baltimore, which is what's depicted here in the center. Let me zoom in a little bit for you. But here up in the left corner, oh, I've got a pointer, there we go. The left corner is Ulysses S. Grant, who at this point was president. And these are all scenes of different ways that African Americans were thinking about and talking about their freedom, and especially what the 15th Amendment and the previous two amendments secured. So the ability here, this is a Bible and here's a church scene, so the ability to practice your religion and practice it in community. The ability to get an education, the ability to get married, choose your own family and then keep that family together. The ability to serve in the military, to grow your own crops, make your own livelihood, to vote, to hold political office, shape your destiny. And they're also calling out various symbols of people, so Abraham Lincoln, John Brown, other big abolitionists, and Black legislators at the time. And there are many prints that have similar small vignettes around here. But this 15th Amendment, and you can see here it's calling this out to the 15th Amendment, was something that was hugely important and symbolic for the Black community when it happened. I just thought this was cool. This is an actual picture of the official in the National Archives 15th Amendment. Get a little bit of a closer look if you like old documents. So here it is saying we're proposing this to go into the Constitution, and then here it is, Section 1, Section 2. Here we go, signed here by the Speaker of the House, Colfax, and over here, President of the Senate Pro Tem, I can't speak tonight, I apologize. But this was hugely popular. Ulysses S. Grant, let me find my quote, here we go. Ulysses S. Grant went on to say, "It's a measure of grander importance than any other one act of the kind from the foundation of our free government to the present day." Frederick Douglass said, "The revolution wrought in our condition by the 15th Amendment is almost startling, even to me. I view it with something like amazement." And as I mentioned before, at the close of the Civil War, just a few years before, this was something that, as much as people were advocating for it, they did not see this as a possibility. One thing I will say, though, is that women were still really upset. They were really upset that this didn't take that positive amendment stance. Congressional leaders had various reasons why they went with this negative amendment version. The idea that fear of a positive amendment would put voting and registration of voters in the hands of the federal government and take it out of the states. And going back to that idea of people's ideas of inalienable rights, civil rights, political rights, and connecting the idea of voting and regulating voting to states was a deeply held idea. Doesn't mean that it's always how it has to be, but in that moment, people were not ready to disconnect those ideas. They didn't want to make that choice, and that's fine, totally fine. But I think it's important to think about ways that people are making choices. They made the choice to frame the amendment this way. Women like Susan B. Anthony considered it a humiliation because though she felt like it left women as the only human beings outside of state prisons and lunatic asylums, adjudged incompetent to cast a ballot. So a lot of women, especially white women, were really upset that it didn't take a broader stance. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton famously also said some really racist things about Black men in particular, who were advocating for the passage of the 15th Amendment, especially from the place like Frederick Douglass saying, let's take our moment. Let's take this moment. We'll keep working on these other ones, but let's take this moment. And people like Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton were saying, well, if we can only have one of us get the right to vote, we want it to be us. And I want to point out that of the women's suffrage movement, this was something that not all women felt equally about. There were many women, especially Black women, who wanted to take this moment for Black men and keep going with the work. But it took women another 50 years to get the right to vote through the passage of the 19th Amendment. But this still was a big deal because now this legislation made the federal government the guarantor of Black voting rights, and a fact that Black people celebrated as the culmination of the age of abolition and the fulfillment of the national promise of democratic inclusion for them. And it created federal standards for voting rights that had formerly been in the purview of states. So even though it still said that states can figure out who has the right to vote, the federal government has a say. It's not just up to the states. And it completed this accumulation of power, of federal power, in relationship to the states, which is a critical legacy of the Civil War. So this is still a big deal. I'll also go back and just say that this was something that not everybody felt was perfect. Thaddeus Stevens has a lot of quotes about the imperfections of voting rights in this moment, but they felt like they were getting there. So a member of Congress from 1869, when they're debating the 15th Amendment and what to include, said, we're slowly approaching a clearer understanding of the rights of persons. This thrown open democratic debate was asking critical questions that people were talking about. A lot of people in Congress, when they cast the ballot or cast the 15th Amendment also as a negative amendment that said you can't explicitly deny people the right to vote based on their race or their previous condition of servitude, it left open for other kinds of discrimination, things like poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, which we know from history in hindsight, a lot of conservative white town or states and communities use, but not just in the South, all over the country. People who were crafting that legislation saw the 14th Amendment, that idea if you are restricting the right of people to vote who are eligible citizens, they're men over the age of 21, they're citizens of the United States, if you're restricting their right to vote, well then Congress is going to dock your appropriation of seats. That's your punishment. So play by the rules, guys. But nobody ever enforced that, as states almost immediately started imposing some of these restrictions, effectively disenfranchising Black voters. One other note I'll say is that northern states and western states advocated for this negative amendment because states like Rhode Island had property requirements, especially for immigrants in their communities, where they were nervous about Irish Catholics in their communities getting too much political power. States like Nevada, California, and Oregon had restrictions on the right to vote because they were worried about Chinese immigrants who were there in their communities having too much political participation. And in order to get this amendment ratified, they advocated for these restrictions and the ability to use poll taxes and literacy tests and property requirements as ways to restrict the right to vote. But the Republicans in Congress who knew that was a possibility because they baked it into the amendment itself, didn't imagine that white Southerners would use that as a way to restrict the African American vote. But they did. And they started slowly at first, but then communities were using greater confidence by the end of the 19th century, especially as the Jim Crow era grew in strength. First, states took away the right to vote from convicted felons and increased the number of felony laws, which had them arrest more or higher numbers of African Americans and effectively disenfranchising them. States passed poll taxes and required that payment in amounts that few cash poor Black families had. And as the years went on, where's my quote here? States also started rewriting state constitutions. Here we go. So for example, the state of Virginia said as they rewrote the state constitution, this was a delegate from the Virginia Democratic Party named J. Taylor Ellison in 1901. He said the convention would never have been held but for the desire of the white people of this commonwealth to have enacted such a constitutional provision as would take away the Negro the right to from the Negro the right to vote, and at the same time preserve to the white men of the commonwealth their right of suffrage. So many states and communities and legislatures were looking at deliberate ways to maintain elite white rule, even if it meant disenfranchising mostly unintentionally, sometimes intentionally, poor white Southerners as well. But by the early 20th century, that right to vote that had been expanded to many Black men was effectively gone in many places. In 1965, during the Civil Rights Movement, and this is a picture from the march in 1965 from Selma to Montgomery, we're advocating for federal intervention to enforce the 15th Amendment. The amendment was still there, just the Supreme Court and Congress were not enforcing it. They had interpreted the laws in other ways and setting precedents, but Congress was also not enforcing the law. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed under that Section 2 of the 15th Amendment, that Congress shall have the right to enforce this legislation in order to remove a lot of those barriers and put protections in place to prevent the discrimination of people. If it's not explicitly by race, those things that disproportionately affected people by their race. But that came back in the 2013 Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder, that removed those a lot of those protections. And the opinion at the time, I'm going to paraphrase here, basically said, it's okay. It's been a while. We're not doing segregation anymore, so it's fine. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg, said in her dissent, throwing out the Voting Rights Act when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. The idea that it's been fascinating for scholars and for voting rights advocates and in communities to look at how we are looking at who has the right to vote today. Did those voting rights protections from the Voting Rights Act in 1965, were those protecting people? Do people need to have a voting ID or an ID to vote? What kinds of things, what kinds of restrictions are we as communities willing to put on the right to vote? Who has the burden of making it easy or difficult for people to vote? These are still things that we're talking about today, and especially as we're thinking about access to polling places, access to who has the rights, if it's restored voting rights for former felons. All of these different things are big questions in our communities. And I say this just because the right to vote has never been a given. It's never been fully defined. It's something that in our history, Americans have challenged and changed, expanded, contracted, redefined, negotiated. Just because it's always been some way doesn't mean that that's always how it's had to be or how it has to continue to be. These are choices that we as people who make this democracy have made to form where we are, but we as people who participate in that can continue to shape how we want to be able to participate and who we want to be able to participate in our government. So with that, I'm going to stop, throw it open to questions with one shout out here to our new exhibit on voting rights and the 15th Amendment called Contested Franchise that we just published. So if you haven't gotten a chance to check it out, I highly encourage you to do so. And also because people have worked really hard to get the right to vote and be able to participate in our country, we encourage you to make sure that if you're able to check your voter registration, register to vote, please vote. No matter who you vote for, this is a key thing that people in our history have worked really hard to do and to shape the history of our future. Okay, I'm really gonna stop now. But if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'm gonna stop sharing. There we go. Okay, let's see. Was a poll tax something you had to pay in order to vote? Yes, and it varied depending on your location. But like I mentioned at the end, this idea that you had to pay a certain fee in order to be eligible to vote, if you didn't have a lot of money, that's a really hard thing to be able to do. And I heard a story recently on the radio of a person who was talking about their grandparents who had this memory of just throwing spare change in a jar, and over the course of the year that spare change would save up to be their poll tax, because even though they weren't a wealthy family, the ability to vote was so crucial to them that they found a way to make it work. See, Anjali, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Oh yes, back to our ideas of what freedom means. Great. Self-determination, dignity, agency. All right, so Anna has a question here. Do we assume freedom means everything? It's a great question. Citizen, suffrage, individual liberties, and that these rights cannot be lessened. Sometimes the issue of the rights of a group are pitted against those of the individual rather than considered an extension of them. Absolutely. I think that's a big part of who we are as a democracy, talking about how my rights or freedoms, how those interact or intersect with the rights or freedoms of a larger group. At what point does one take precedence over the other? Does it ever? The way we've defined it in the past is imperfect humans coming together and make those choices and kind of get these into laws or into customs. But we are humans also, and we have the ability as people who live here to continue to shape that. Let's see. Betsy, do democracies with very high percentages of voters regard voting as an obligation rather than a right? You know, that would be something I would encourage people who know of other examples to share. I don't actually know, but I do know that one time, for example, when I went to Peru and voting was a national holiday, they just have proportionally higher numbers of people who vote. That's something that's just like, why don't more Americans vote? You have the ability to do so. What are you doing, folks? Get out and shape this. Why are you throwing away this opportunity and not taking advantage of that? But I think that is an idea that many people in other countries who do have higher proportions of their citizenry participating in elections have when they look at the United States. Angela says, in my work, I often have to interact with those that believe that no rights exist. I would ask how to discuss or defend our cherished rights with those that contend only the state has the right to grant privileges. How would you explain the very existence of inalienable rights? Without this premise, all rights for everyone evaporate. That's a great question. So I will point out something that has been such a super accessible book. I mean, you can see with all my little notes here, is the book by Eric Foner, The Second Founding, that explores the 3 Reconstruction Amendments, their origins and their aftermath. And he does a great job looking at the history, but also bringing in the constitutional philosophy of how people were approaching these amendments and evolving them over time. And one thing that stuck with me today as I was reviewing some of this before the talk was the idea that the idea of states' rights were more to protect order and just the logistics of things, and not really meant to define personal freedoms in any way. That states' rights were just to keep everybody from running off the rails, but not necessarily to prescribe values or get at those inalienable rights. That's something that the federal government got in the business of doing when it started with these Reconstruction Amendments, starting to say it's not just how you protect the power or the people in states from the federal government, but here the federal government has the ability and the responsibility to say that there are some things that are more important than even your national identity. So in the 14th Amendment, the idea that it's not just citizens who get equal protection of the law, but anybody here in the United States gets equal protection of the law. Some things just transcend parts of your identity. I don't have a great answer to your question, Angelo, but to me, those are some of the ideas that your question generates. I'd encourage people who might have another idea or explanation to add that into the chat. Yep, Patricia notes that one historian suggested that the Supreme Court has punted on voting rights. I mean, this is a hot topic right now. Who has access to voting? How safe is our election to vote? How, you know, these are things we're talking about. And that reminds me a lot of people talking about the way that they wanted their democracy to operate coming out of the Civil War when they're reshaping things. This is a great time to think about it and to talk about it in your communities with your policymakers. Anjali mentions that in Brazil, she thinks it's mandatory to vote there. Eric Foner has a lecture series on his book, The Second Founding, on the Gilder Lehrman Institute, so definitely check that out. There's some great podcasts that cover this. The Washington Post had a podcast series called Constitutional about different themes in the Constitution and looking at their origins and their evolution. Eric Foner is kind of like the guy when it comes to having researched and written about Reconstruction and the constitutionality of it, and he shows up on that podcast a couple of times. The Reconstruction series by Henry Louis Gates Jr. on PBS is also great in episodes 1 and 2 about this evolution of how drastically people changed their ideas about what was included as essential to freedom. And yes, Betsy, definitely check out the contested franchise. Okay, I couldn't paraphrase it. I'm just gonna read you this final paragraph from Eric Foner's book. So that the amendments and the legislation implementing them went far beyond what most white Americans had thought possible or desirable in 1865. People who entered the Civil War as moderates emerged committed to remaking the South's political, economic, and social system. Opponents of Black suffrage in 1865 came to support it just a few years later. Those who rejected federal prohibition of discrimination by private businesses at the outset of Reconstruction voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which did precisely that. Some Republicans came to insist that access to education was as fundamental to citizenship as other rights. The Second Founding can only be understood as part of a much longer debate about rights, democracy, and equality, one that continues to this day. So with that, unless there are any other questions, I want to thank you all for joining us here on a Monday evening. I've lost track of the day of the week because it's a pandemic and that's what it does to time. But thank you for your continued support. Thank you for continuing to participate in our programs. Please join us next month for Brianna's awesome talk, and stay well, stay safe. Go vote. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Stephanie, so much for that insightful and very timely talk. And yes, y'all join us next month for our History Happy Hour on the Norfolk Race Riot. And check out our website so you can have a look at that contested franchise exhibit. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and everybody have a good rest of your week.